for universities? And the answer was no, because there may be experiences at the individual level that are driven by our identity as Latino, Hispanic, Black, Brown, whatever you want to sort of think of yourself as, that may contribute to shaping who you are. And so if a college or university is asking, tell us about an experience when you overcame hardship or when you achieved something that you thought was not possible, and what did you learn from it on a college essay application, for example? The individual can talk about their experience from the perspective of their race or their ethnic identity and say, you know, I was the only Southeast Asian student at a school where there was predominantly white students, and that experience shaped me in the following ways, and I learned how to relate to people differently, and I became a better person as a result of that experience. And then the university can look at that and say, oh, this demonstrates grit, this demonstrates self-confidence, this demonstrates some other characteristic that they believe will add to the student body. That is okay. That is possible when the university is looking to the experience that the individual puts forward to communicate something that is not just about the racial identity. So in short, and I'm sure there's other things that can be added to this, it's a relatively complicated decision. The dissents and the concurrences are, I think, 3-4 times longer than the decision itself. The main takeaway is, if race is brought into the equation by the individual to explain an individualized characteristic or experience, it is, and then indirectly informs the decision of the admissions committee through some other neutral characteristic, then there is nothing impermissible or wrong about that. So you can't be affirmatively race conscious, but the decision does not prohibit or make it so that you have to ignore the realities of race altogether. That's how I would sum it up in short, and that has now created questions about how we use race and how we think about race and ethnicity and maybe other protected characteristics in other areas that are not just higher education, but employment, membership associations, contracting, et cetera. And I think we can get into that a little bit more with the other panelists.
And Rosavelli, I know you, when we talked earlier, you had some kind of very strong opinions kind of on what these implications meant specifically for education, but for corporate America. So I was wondering if you could expand on that for us.
Oh, happy to. As you can imagine, we've been having lots of discussions since the decision came out. And one thing that I'd like to remind people is that that decision was very specific to the space of education. Now, we have been seeing, as was indicated in terms of Robbie, going after companies trying to expand how that decision should impact other companies, other corporations. And it's important to recognize that this is what has happened. They've been, right, immediately after the decisions, there were at least 13 letters sent out to attorney generals threatening them if they didn't enforce the decision. There were, our CEO received one, many law firm CEOs received letters threatening to sue them, for their DEI programs, right? An overextension of the decision, because the decision, again, did we had one against a law firm who had a DEI program or a scholarship, right? They were sued, but why did they particularly pick that law firm? Because their program was specifically a scholarship for LGBTQ plus students. Now, many other law firms have those same DEI programs and initiatives, but they were written slightly different, where we assess a person's commitment to DEI. So we're not giving you a scholarship because you identify as Latino or you identify as Black or LGBTQ plus. We're giving a scholarship because it is specific to the commitment to diversity in the communities. And diversity, right, how we define diversity over the years has been very expansive, right? Whether it's race, whether it's age, whether it's sexual orientation, disability. In some instances, your experiences, socioeconomic particularly. In the US, we don't talk a lot about socioeconomic, but in many other countries, it is a protected class too in terms of social mobility, right? So our scholarship itself really talks about that commitment. Now, because of how society, right, and just the systemic oppression that many of our communities have or have been living through, right, 90% of the students that apply and show that commitment are actually diverse students, right? So that is not a violation of any law. But I do think that it's really important for us to think about, are we reacting out of fear when we're running to change a program? Or is there something in the program that could potentially put us at risk, right? So you do need to have a risk assessment done, right? You need to look at what your organization is doing, particularly how you are articulating your initiatives, right? I, highly advise that you think about, is there counsel that I can talk to and think about, is it what I'm doing or is it how I'm talking about the program, right? Because another law firm that I got into too, it was more of the way that they were promoting their program, because in fact, if you looked at the essence of the program, it was not discriminatory in any way. They were just really promoting it to a particular market, right? So marketing is a group that really you need to be in contact between legal. Somebody earlier said, right, legal is your friends. Legal is definitely your friends, but you need to look at you also need to look at all of your, sort of kind of how you go to market with your programs, right? So that whether that's your communications teams, your communication strategies, your marketing strategies, all of those need to be looked at, right? Again, taking this moment as a self-reflection moment, DEI is always under attack, right? 10 years ago when we were talking about DEI, it was really about representation, about how many people do we have in the seats. So what happens now? We have lots of people in the seats. So now everybody are like, oh, wait, we have too many of you in the seats. So now what are we going to do? Okay, well, no, this is not fair. There's too many of you, right? Well, so that's why I feel like this is a good thing, right? Because we are in the seats. Many of you talked about being first generation professionals. I am myself first generation Latina, law student, everything all along the way, right? And we're here. But when I think about DEI, I've never thought about it from the perspective of like how I identify it. I've always thought about it, how am I managing my talent? Do I have the programs and resources in place to make sure that anybody that's at my organization can thrive, right? And that realizing that has to look differently for the different groups of people that we have in our organization. So thinking about your talent management and not necessarily about the numbers or the percentages, because naturally, I'm sure earlier they talked about the number of Latinos that we have already. Naturally, we're going to be in the seats. Just look at our pipeline. Look at how, just the next generation that's coming through, right? Multi-ethnic groups that are coming in, very super diverse. So it's really about, do we have the right programs in place to support the talent that currently exists? So it might be that you're shifting your narrative, but stay committed to the work.
And Alejandro, I want to ask you one of the more practical questions. And now what? And now what, right? And so Roseveli tells us, this is what the law technically allows, but a lot of companies are nervous. And kind of what is it that they can and should be doing? I know that there's in terms of legal advice, but then there's a practical matter in and above kind of just what is technically legal and protected versus if Robbie's coming for you and he says on Friday he's got a video that's going to drop next Thursday right before Black Friday, and you're Walmart, what do you have to do between now and next Thursday to make sure he doesn't blow up your Black Friday?
This is a very loaded question. It depends on your personality as an institution, I think, first and foremost, right? I tend to think of myself as a person who doesn't cave to fear. I generally sort of look beyond it, embrace myself, and throw myself into the work. And I think that's really what we all need to do, is throw ourselves into the work. And I appreciate, and we had this conversation, there may be moments where in the short term, there's a cost, right? But the cost is outweighed by the benefits of your DEI programs. And it really does depend on what is the priority. And yes, there's economics and finances involved, and I don't have the manner in which to calibrate, right, the value, but I know what my principles are, and that's what I've upheld at the firm that I work at and the firm that I worked at before then. And sometimes it does come at a cost. Depends on what we're willing to pay. The way I view it and the way I was raised by my mom was my integrity doesn't have a price, and so I continue to push for what I think is right. And despite the developments that I think we've all, I don't want to say experienced, I think we've suffered these developments, we're realizing that we're resilient, we have grit, we've been here before. This is not the first time we have been attacked as a community. It's not the first time we've seen others in other parallel communities be attacked. We recover, we fight, we live another day. And that's what we're going to do now, right? We represent, we empower our communities, we bring forth the value that we contribute to our societies and our communities. And I think that's the importance of this group and this foundation. With specific cases, you know, I'm hardcore. And I'm like, sorry, everybody, screw it. I'm not going to cave to this guy. This guy is a horrible human being. He stands for nothing and he falls for everything. So specifically for him, I have no sympathy and no tolerance. And I know that that sounds like very easy to say sitting at this podium, but I've experienced in my own personal life. And I'm not willing to cave to a bully because I've been bullied enough.
The next question I wanted to think about was, what is the, you talked about kind of your corporate culture. What is it that your company stands behind? And kind of in the business that I do, I'm a lobbyist. I work with companies kind of throughout Washington on terms of policy, and this has kind of bled into that. You see Congress kind of dealing with it, and even this administration kind of going into it. But what does your company or your institution, the nonprofit you work for, your school, kind of what are those characteristics that drive your business or bottom line or your mission? And I want to go to Jamie Dimon had a kind of a way to think about it. Like, you shouldn't partake in DEI because it's just the right thing to do, but because it should drive your bottom line. A lot of companies were doing DEI because they were like, I acknowledge that my consumers are part of this diverse community. I acknowledge that my sales associates are part of this diverse community. I acknowledge that promoting them, my consumers and my associates, whatever it may be, the people that make up my own business are part of this. So doing this helps them, helps me, helps my bottom line. And so I guess I wanted to talk to you guys about your advice for kind of how do you implement a DEI program that is good for business?
Well, I think that the motivation of business is an important part of it, right? Because if what you're trying to do is, again, pursue some neutral objective, increasing the bottom line, having employees or having members of your association that contribute a certain characteristic, even if you were to extend the decision of the Supreme Court to these other areas, right, you're not making decisions that are based on the racial classification, right? And I think that is important. But to the point about being, the corporate personality, I think, is important. Is your organization in it for the public fight? And as bruising as it may be, right, because it probably will be bruising, very bruising, legally, the risk reputationally in terms of the costs of fighting these issues out in public. Are you in it for the long haul? Are you just trying to navigate and lay low while the storm passes? I think those are things that, as an organization, as a company, you have to kind of be introspective about. And lawyers are your friends at this time, right? Bringing counsel in to do, like Rosvelli said, a impact assessment of the organization to understand, where do we stand with our current programming in light of the challenges that are coming. Fearless Fund is one case that you all may be very familiar with, right? The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said that they were going to enjoin the Fearless Fund from giving grants to black women-owned businesses because they thought it created a contract that gave a benefit to this group to the exclusion of others. The case settled, and reports say that it settled because the litigants on the side representing the black women entrepreneurs didn't want to continue the fight in such a hostile court environment and then create even worse precedent. So I think you have to balance out all of those different considerations and say, I want to fight, I want to stand for what I believe in, but am I potentially doing more harm in the long term or potentially creating a very bruising battle in the short term that doesn't achieve the ultimate goal that I'm trying to achieve. So those, I think, are things that you have to analyze internally and with the advice of counsel in this particular moment in time.
I think that's really important, that you're going to read a lot of things in the media and you got to take a step back and understand the context. They made a decision in this particular case that this wasn't the right audience to bring this forward, right? Because it was going to hurt the law in other jurisdictions, and potentially would be better to litigate this potential case in a different jurisdiction with a different audience. And so sometimes cases settle because they're really thoughtful about the future, right? And now creating that bad law in this particular case. But I would say within your organizations, I think it's important to realize that data is your friend, right? There's tons of research that has shown the benefits of DEI for an organization, particularly the profitability, productivity, right? And so relying on the concrete business aspects as you're talking about your work is more important in this particular time period, right? Really using what you have, those strengths, to articulate why you need to do what you need to do. So it goes back to that, how are you servicing your client, right? What market are you in? Kind of looking at that market and that audience, and then also looking internally, who are our employees, right? What obligation do we owe them, and using that data to inform the types of programs that you set forth. Again, the programs don't necessarily have to be limited because of these classifications, but the programs in general should address the issues or maybe the challenges that the individuals that your organization has and is servicing, that those programs are set and take into consideration their experiences, right? So again, it's a kind of a shift in terms of how you're looking at it. You're not doing this because the person is racially, ethnically diverse, right? You're doing this because these people that work for me have had these challenges, and I have to find a way and to, give them the opportunity. Right? I'm creating more equitable sort of spaces. That also thinks about, how are you developing your talent from a leadership perspective, making sure that your managers and leaders are able to support their workforce. That requires some training, that requires some education, right, around these challenges. So, we're hearing, right, you can't mandate DEI training. Okay, that's fine. I'm not mandating DEI training, but I am thinking about how, if you have an increased emotional intelligence regarding your workforce, how do you then increase their professional growth? How do I provide them with those professional growth, right, opportunities? And all of that should address the fact that we have biases, and they do show up in terms of how we develop our talent, how we mentor, how we sponsor, right? I don't have to have a specific sponsorship program that's related to DEI, but I do need to recognize if this particular group is not getting sponsors, I need to find a way to make sure that that group is getting sponsors. So use that data to inform, and again, how are you communicating your strategies, right? Is this part of your strategic plan? It comes from your leadership, right? We talked about integrity of your leadership, right? And if it's not there, it needs to come from both ends, right? It's not just, it's got to come from the top down, but it also means that those people who are in middle management, because a lot of us, that's the bottleneck, right? Is the middle management. For me, that's always a key. It's like, how are we developing that middle management so that they are better able to support our workforces?
If I may. I think the data shows that, I don't know if this is working out, okay. The data shows that the diversity, the wealth of diversity and experiences and background of our workforces really permeates and impacts the mission of the organization. And we don't have to look sort of at the data. For all of those that work in corporate settings, we see it day to day. And you realize that when you have a homogeneous group of people, that doesn't really have the force and drive that the organization needs. It's only when we see diversity of opinion and experience that we really palpably sense that there is a driving force in the organization, empirically speaking, right? The data is helpful to support, and I absolutely agree with you, because that's what's used to objectively convince others, right, of the importance of this mission. But we experience it day to day. And I think you used the words doom and gloom when we were chatting earlier, but this is not doom and gloom times, right? We've been here before, and we've seen what other organizations do in this space and have historically done in the space. The NAACP, Lambda Legal, all these organizations that have represented other minorities, or I don't want to even call ourselves a minority because we're not, but other groups of people, they have the playbook. And that's the playbook that we as a community need to study evaluate, and implement. Whether it's impact litigation, as you've indicated, whether it's lobbying and changing laws or overriding Supreme Court decisions that impact our communities, we can do this, and we will, and we need to, because we already know that it's beneficial to our businesses, and we see how it impacts the proverbial bottom line. And that's typically a question that you'll get asked. And the reality is, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more diverse your workforce, the more impact on the bottom line. Because guess what? The consumers and the takers of our services, they're diverse too.
I think we probably have time for one question, but I think kind of in response to Alejandro's comment, 2044, that is the year that we are projected where Caucasians will be the minority in our populace here in the United States. And as I think about that, I mean, Latinos are 19% of the population, right? And so add to that African Americans and Asians and what have you, pretty soon Caucasians become the minority. And so there is a changing landscape overall. So to your point, like we've been here before, we'll continue to go through. Maybe they're feeling a little threatened because they're a little nervous to know what it feels like to be in our shoes. But in any event, okay, so we've got time, I think, for one question. If there's yes, ma'am.
I have a question. My name is Vanessa, and the question's Mike. I want to be able to.
Oops.
I want to be able to confidently speak about, these legal situations and what is right from wrong. So, Juan, you mentioned don't make a decision based on race classification. But if I'm a marketer, let's say, and I want to put a program out in place to target Hispanics because it is going to help my bottom line, is that legally acceptable or not?
I think that you have to look at, this is a classic lawyer answer, right? It depends. I think you have to look at the specific situation, and I certainly wouldn't purport to be giving you legal advice right now or even speaking for my law firm. But but because it's such a specific question, I think you are right that you have to look at the entire set of facts, right? You have to look holistically at your program. You have to say, what am I trying to achieve? Is it just to add a certain number of Latino, Hispanic employees, or to promote a certain number of, or a certain class? Or am I trying to achieve some other neutral objective, like the bottom line, like adding more people that have demonstrated success over, through hardship? When you think about it in those terms, at least under the Supreme Court decision, right, it's hard to say that you're making decisions based on race, even if the individual participants who are coming to you as a result of that, like Roseli was saying with the fellowship program that says, oh, talk to us about your commitment to diversity. And you may end up getting a lot of applicants who are talking about their commitment to diversity that happen to be diverse. And so you have an applicant pool that reflects maybe a demographic that you feel would bring that to the table. But it can't be about the demographic. It can't be about you are Latino and therefore you must think this way and you're going to contribute. It must be, tell me individually why you can bring this to the table.
Yeah. And I would just ask yourself, am I excluding someone from applying because of their race, right? And in this situation, the way you market the program, it might be that the people who find the program more appealing are the group that you're trying to target, right? But that doesn't mean that you're preventing someone else because of their race from applying for the program, right? So something to think about, what are those check boxes? That would be one that I would add to that.
And I wasn't sure if you were talking about employment or talking about the sale of services or products to the community.
It's more about the product, but it's just
Okay, that's sort of what I thought, so I was just going to say, go ahead. Sell what you need to sell. Target the audience you need to target. This is what every company does. Every company produces segments of products for particular markets because that's what their consumer needs. There is no discriminatory effect in doing so. There is no issue regarding identifying who your market is. That's completely legitimate. On the employment side, my suggestion is always make sure that the panels that are interviewing are diverse themselves, because that's the gatekeeper. And when you don't have a heterogeneous panel interviewing, you end up with the same type of people coming in. So A lot of the work that we're going to need to do relates to internal bias, right? That's really the challenge, right? The objective sort of outward looking, look at the audience and how many people do you have in each type of, category, classification, et cetera. That's not the issue, right? That's the optics of it. The reality is we need to combat internally bias because that's the filter by which we don't break the cycle. But on products, you're good. I mean, just look at Colgate and Palmolive and everybody else. They have their, specific toothpaste for, guys like me.
Hey, just wanted to jump in. So my name is Nicole Amato, and I am part of the multicultural marketing team at PepsiCo, specifically focused on Hispanic marketing. And so I'd say absolutely, you can target Hispanic consumers. And if you want to talk more about that, we should chat.
I think we have time for one last question. Anybody else? Yes.
Hi, Saidi Herrera with the Oklahoma Historical Society, and our population it's primarily white Caucasian, and they're afraid of just discussing the topic. So how do you ease the fears of those who feel threatened just by including the rest of us?
Again, one of the things that I tell folks when they think about how to interrupt bias, right? I tell people the easiest thing is a coffee conversation. And how are you connecting with the person to better understand where that fear is coming from? And when you better understand where that fear is coming from, then you're better prepared to engage them on a conversation that does not focus on fear, but just sort of thinks about the human connection and why this is important for us as individuals and beings, right? We tend to over-rely on, on bias, right? We talked about it. We tend to, kind of over-rely on, what we have been taught, what we've been learned, what we hear in the media, all these things that are really being presented to us through a very specific lens and really sort of targeted, right? And so we have to recognize that and take a step back and think about, finding that connection, because I think sometimes we focus so much on differences and we don't realize that we have a lot of commonality. And when we talk and when we spend time cultivating relationships, we can identify those commonalities, and then we can have conversations, right, that are not out of fear, right, but that are thinking about how can we approach this in a way that makes you feel okay about the conversation and makes me, I talk, when it comes to DI, I always say I'm kind of a bridge and kind of figure out where someone is at, and then how do you bring people together to have these conversations? Because they're not easy conversations to have, but it's, you have to be willing to engage, and even sometimes when you know someone's coming at you, you don't want to bother, right? Because it's hard, and hey, how could you have so strong feelings? But just take a step back and better understand, why do you feel this way? What's making you approach it this way? That would be my recommendation.
I was just going to add, and part of what I love about this organization is the name. We are losing our humanity. Look at our communities, look at our schools, look at our organizations, look at our government. We are losing our humanity. And that loss has led to the loss of connection that you're describing, and that has led to the division and the you're good, they're bad mentality. The world is full of color and its gradations of black, white, and gray, and we've lost sight of that. And so that connection, it's looking at the grays. And I think that we need to live in the gray, because if we don't, we're just becoming more polarized and puppeted, right, by government and institutions. So it's our mission, right, to develop that humanity, to exercise the muscle of humanity, which is empathy and connection. And it sounds all very loosey-goosey sometimes and very rosy-colored glasses type thing. But the reality is, when you talk to people, when you engage with people, when you understand people and they understand you, there's greater ability to work through problems than if you didn't. And I think that you and I agree on this. It's really where the focus is. And it's not easy, because sometimes you're fed up and you're tired and exhausted and overworked, and you're just trying to deal with your own circumstances, you don't have time for humanity. And that's precisely the problem that we're all experiencing and should work through.
Well, thank you all again for joining us today. I think there's the conversation continues with the next panel on another kind of subset of these issues on DEI. But again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you afterwards. Rosavelli, Juan, and Alejandro. Thank you.
Thank you all. We are here probably for one of the most expected panel discussions of today, which is, it stems out of the panel we just heard, and is how do we communicate that? Or as we would say in Latin America, ¿cómo se come eso? Right? How do we craft compelling narratives? Bulletproof narratives that allow us to get our point across, that allow us to persuade others to join our cause. How do we bring people along? And while I always say that we have an easy exit by educating people on the fact that Latinos, we are not a race. We are not even an ethnicity within us. There are so many ethnicities. We are a community. And we come in every color and every size and every background. The Hispanics from Spain consider themselves white, for example. So I think it's important that we know that. But in the most corporate sense, when it comes to brands in particular, this panel will address how can we craft those narratives and get that point across. So the first question I have for the panel is based on recent data that shows that only 2 in 5 US adults are aware of companies rolling back DEI initiatives. So how does this limited awareness impact perception? How do we move forward from these? And how should organizations frame this data, perhaps, to shape their narrative?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this important conversation. Awareness is everything. To be aware is to be awake of the reality that we are facing today. And without the right narratives, this is going to be impossible. But we need to be aware of something that is crucial today, that is the rollbacks are real. The situation that we are facing is real. And unless we're doing something about it, we're just going to fall victims into this. So the rollbacks that we're seeing are from sometimes companies that maybe started this approach on a more performative side. But there are some other companies that are doing this from the core perspective that they have on their DNA values. It's a pillar of their organizations, and therefore the narratives are going to be constructed from the perspective of the companies that truly believe in that and that are willing to stand their ground no matter what the political changes are going to be. And then from the consumer perspective is understanding and waking up to know what is our real power. And our real power is going to be how are we going to utilize our economic power to make sure that we're supporting the companies that support us back. So it is scary sometimes when we see these big corporations rolling back and we are all afraid. Is it something that we should all go and do? How are we going to be able to retaliate and make sure that we are being seen and that we're not scared about this? So in terms of the narratives, from the perspective of the companies, if you are standing your ground on DEI, on diversity, and you want to be on the right side of the story, you just have to make sure that it's part of your marketing initiatives, it's just part of your communication strategy, and that you know that there's going to be a lot more impact, economic impact, cultural impact, social impact, if you just avoid rolling back any kind of DEI initiatives. And discrimination is never a business. There's a lot more business always when you go to diversity. So I always love to say that this is not only the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do.
And I guess a point there is that a color we all like, regardless of our background, is green, right? So this is about the power of green. the power of the dollar. And I love what you said about true values, right, versus performative. I think this is a moment of truth, what we're seeing. We're seeing the real faces of corporate America, and we're being able to really assess which brands really are anchored in values that include us versus those that have been just jumping on the bandwagon because it seemed like the nice thing to do, but it's really not something that is part of their DNA. So how do we craft a compelling narrative around, for those corporations that are really anchored on those values?
Yeah, I think as a communicator, the job of the function, my view is to be the conscience of the organization. I don't believe in crafting narratives. I believe in crafting truth. And so the first responsibility is to ask, what's behind this decision? I believe that in the post-George Floyd era, it was too easy for people to jump in on this values conversation. It was a marketing ploy. It was green. That's what it was. If it weren't green, if it weren't a marketing ploy, you wouldn't see the rollbacks. And I find that, horribly disappointing. I've been at 3 different consumer brands over the course of my career, and the internal conversations around value versus marketing are so incredibly obvious. I also think that it's unfortunately a lot easier in a capitalistic society to be driven to fear by Robbie Starbuck, especially as a publicly traded company, because you simply do not have the consumer willpower to punish the companies who walk away from us. I walk by Chick-fil-A's as a gay man every single day and shake my head in disappointment, right? I fucking love their chicken, right? But I will not eat that chicken, right? And if we as communities don't find if we don't find the willpower to punish this type of walk back in terms of said support for us, shame on us, right? Because that's the give and take in capitalism, right, is my wallet.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's also important for companies to understand that some of these is actually not necessarily, tied to their best interest. Right, Jason?
Absolutely. So, hola mi gente, ¿qué tal? So yeah, this is so loaded, and I love this conversation and the question. But I think I'm going to start by rooting us in some data first, right? So you talked about the perception gap. 73% of consumers want their brands and their companies to stand for anything related to D&I. But on the other side of that, 19% of consumers don't want any of their brands to say anything political, right? So that not only speaks to the perception gap around DE&I and the value of it, but I think it's an education gap, right? A lot of people don't understand what DE&I is. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is. So my personal definition and my approach as it relates to DE&I is that it's an operating system, right? It's just the way that you do business, from how you engage with talent to how you go to market with your clients. It's everything in between. So I think part of that, and when you look at it that way, I have to be honest. Those of us that are DE&I practitioners, probably dropped the ball coming out of 2020. 2020 was a time of reckoning and a time of, really carrying the flag around equity and inclusion. But we failed to evolve the thinking and the language around the conversation. And I think we need to really do a better job of re-articulating the value of DE&I moving forward, because if we're still talking about representation in 3 years as the solve for all of our issues, we've completely missed the boat, right? And so, going back to Oriel's point about the business, oftentimes, and in my role when I advise our clients, the conversation is about future-proofing their business, right? It's about thinking the future consumer, how to tap into that future consumer today through the lens of inclusion and belonging. it's not just about future-proofing the business. It's important, but it's about really articulating a different framework for the role of brand in today's culture to create new frameworks for inclusion for everybody. And I think that's what we've seen, coming out of the election, is that, a group of people felt behind. They felt left behind. And I think that's our job as people that are tasked with creating cultures of inclusion and belonging for everybody, is to articulate a new vision that not only advocates for marginalized folks, for sure, but also advocates for those folks that feel that perhaps they've been left behind.
I agree. I think it's a time of recalibration where we really bring forward inclusivity for all, where there's no progress if our work is leaving half of the country behind. So in terms of that, obviously, DEI continues to be influential in consumer behavior. So how can brands authentically, especially for you, Ben, perhaps from the communications perspective, how can they authentically integrate that new calibration and that inclusivity for all in their message in a way that, sort of serves everybody and serves the purpose to continue to advance the work?
Yeah, I think we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about external and marketing. And as a CCO, I always started internally, right? If I'm going to live a value, then I want my workforce to understand and believe that. Now, that may sound altruistic, or I don't know what it sounds, right? I just want to be really transparent. It was partly manipulative, right? Because if I create expectation internally that the enterprise says it's going to live this way, then the biggest source of outrage would be, and the biggest source of pressure outside of shareholder, right, would be the employee population, right? So that's also, I think, a way to bulletproof the notion of narrative in terms of, is the CEO or leadership team, how are they going to live that in front of the workforce? How are they going to embody that? And from a day-to-day standpoint, once you have it internal, I think it becomes a lot easier to manifest externally, right? It's not a marketing campaign, right? I think, I've always done communications, and it was always draft the key messages. Well, first I've got to know the truth, right? I mean, one of the words I most detest in my profession is spin, right? That's part of why we are where we are. There's too much spinning, right? And what you're seeing now is the unravel of spin, right? Where I leaned into something that I didn't truly believe in, and now I'm actually spinning because I'm scared, right? And if you were a stalwart, if you really believed it, if it were grounded and founded internally, if it were a cornerstone, which is a value, not a personality trait, but a value, then I think it becomes a lot more immovable. A lot more immovable. Yeah.
I love that. And so to build on that, in my conversations with our clients, as we're developing marketing campaigns and narratives, oftentimes I hear, well, Jason, we care about this, but we don't want to alienate our core audience, right? Which is code, right? And my pushback to that is, even in a room full of homogenous, let's call them white men, there are dimensions of diversity that any brand can talk to and speak to credibly and authentically. Our job is to, and their job is to do the work to identify what those identity markers are that feel relevant to the brand, and then develop the language to then articulate that, moving forward. But I always fall back on the age-old adage of acts, not ads, right? It's what are you doing as opposed to what are you communicating?
That's good.
Just to add to that, Ben, from the inside out, always. Companies are coming to talk to us, and they ask for quick wins, and they want to just capitalize on, jump on a wagon. Those are the ones that are going to not stand the ground because they feel scared. And when we talk about training, it's the fundamental number one step. For a company to truly know that this is something that they want to do, training is the number one step, because then you have to understand that from the top down, leaders are aware of why this is important. It's not something that is pushed because it's agenda, because it's fashionable. They need to anchor it in their true root and DNA, because otherwise how employees of a company will follow something if the leaders are not taking care of that, if they feel that this is not something important to them. So the number one people that have to be rooted, before talking about marketing, before talking about how we're going to compel the acquisition power of the community to like us, first is like, you really have to believe in it. It has to be authentic. And leaders have to be the ones leading the way to be able to stand their ground, not only to the employees, but also when media is coming and asking, and there's turmoil, and they're afraid, they need to be able to say, yes, this is something that we really believe. We're not scared of this. This is the DNA of our company. But this can only be accomplished if leaders are thoughtful, and they go through training, and they make sure everyone has the same level of understanding. All the company, from the CEO to the person that is selling the product, has to have the same level of understanding of why DEI is important, why diversity is important for the company, and it's something that is a non-negotiable for anyone.
And that is important because it's important for shareholder value and for the organization growth and innovation and for the future, right? But how we move forward, bringing the people skeptical along? How do we address their concerns? And I love what you said, Jason, about perhaps looking into psychographics rather than demographics, right?
You know, I was at a conference recently, and I heard a quote that was super powerful, and it stuck with me, and I think it's applicable in this conversation. And that is, and it was talking about politics and the results of the election and all that, but I think it's applicable to business as well. And the quote was, in business, there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And I think when you think about that, it sounds very cold and it sounds very heartless, but I think that's the language that not only that's the context that we have to think about as we move forward in bringing everyone along. You know, this isn't about doing the right thing. This isn't about this isn't just about making opportunities available for folks that have not had opportunities. This is about creating cultures of belonging that unlock inclusive and intersectional value that then we benefit from, right? If the color is green, right, then how do we make more green? We make more green by innovating more, by disrupting more, by growing more, and all of those outcomes, the ingredients to that are diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Even if you call it something else.
Yeah, I think the psychographic pivot is an important one. We spend a lot of time looking at check boxes, right? I think a big pivot, like just a very specific example of what I mean by psychographic changes is at Peloton, right? When I got there, our target, the bullseye, the core, right, was the 25 to 42-year-old female fitness enthusiast, right? When I left, we had morphed that bullseye, which was 5 times larger, to a functional fitness advocate, right? Functional fitness means I can get through my day. Getting through my day at 20 is very different than getting through my day at 80. But functional fitness matters to that 20-year-old and that 80-year-old, and that's a different way to communicate. So if I can have internal conversations that are values-based, that don't look at gay, don't look at brown as the starting point, but look at the end game of what, to the point of humanity, right? Like, what do we have in common, which is, exactly what you were saying.
That's an excellent point.
I believe that at the end of the day, one size fits all is also not great for the current landscape that we're living in. Regulations are different in different states, let alone different countries. And the DEI initiatives have to be a reflection of the corporate culture and the society that lives within the companies. So I believe that as we are evolving DEI, it has to be more tailored to every place. Company values have to have very structured pillars, but it's not a checkbox. It's understanding and engaging with the stakeholders of your company to understand what is really important for my people and how this company will reflect that. In a sense of not having to talk about quotas or talking about making sure that we're having checkboxes, because that's what making people afraid. People feel that we're taking away from them as we're going through those checkboxes. So it's about recalibrating DEI and saying, how are we going to reassess the approach to DEI to make sure that it's authentic to the people that I represent, which is at the end of the day, my customers and my employees.
And I know that we're burning questions in the audience. Claudia being the first one.
So thank you so much. I know that this is an issue that is in the minds of everybody. I don't think that anybody would be here if they wouldn't care about DNI. So we're talking to the converters. How do we communicate it? Do we remove from the World Human website the fact that we're diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we turn our language and say, like, this is where growth happens? Or, like, at the end of the day, I think that we just need to know how do we spell it out, because we know that we don't want to lose the programs. We know that this is the right thing to do. This is a good thing to do. This is the way to go. But how do we erase the E&I because it has been politicized and it has become something that, we think it's more controversial than helping?
I just had that conversation with a mentor of mine because I was like, I need to change my title, all right? And no, seriously, I need to change my title not only from being able to drive these programs, but also from a safety perspective, right? From an awareness perspective. So that's another conversation. But I think there's value in. I'm of two minds here. On one side, I say no. We keep the name, we keep the acronym, and we keep moving forward, because at the end of the day, companies are still going to need diverse talent. They're still going to need to create an environment for that talent to grow and flourish, and they're still going to need to create cultures that then lead to all of the innovation and growth, et cetera. So in my mind, that the work isn't going to change regardless of what we call it. But calling it something different, to me, feels like we're capitulating to something that doesn't need to be capitulated to, right? It's all narrative, it's all storytelling, right? So that's one side of it. But on the other side of it is, and it's what I said earlier, I think we have to do a better job of articulating what this is fundamentally, right? DE&I is not just about programming. It's not just about unconscious bias training, right? It's not just about Hispanic Heritage Month every September 15th to October 15th, right? DE&I fundamentally is about how people learn, connect, and grow with one another, right? And how we create an environment for those people to flourish. That work is not going anywhere, right? And so I think, yeah, perhaps we can revisit how we articulate it, but I don't think we should shy away from calling it what it is right now, because that's what we do, and it'll always remain no matter what happens. Now, I will acknowledge, and I'm sorry I'm going a little bit long-winded, we are one Supreme Court decision away. We are one executive order away that doesn't require a Supreme Court decision from DE&I being illegal. Let's call it what it is, right? But what does that mean? That means that we won't be able to track our KPIs the way that we do today. That means that we need to change the way that what we call our programs, moving away from cohort specific to all-inclusive language. So that's going to change, and that has to change. So we have to take the context, the legal, the social, political context in play when we're talking about D&I programming moving forward.
And what I've heard about from clients have been leaning on respect, corporate citizenship, and inclusivity as the key terminology to advance like bulletproof narratives. So really lean into that, like a growth engine rooted in inclusivity. That's what Hispanic Star is.
I also, when we had a conversation thinking about today, Jason really hit me hard in the notion of the diversity as table stakes. Now, I want to be really clear. That's easy for a white guy to say, right? And it's infuriating that the very people who've been in power forever, right, straight white men, are the ones who feel left behind. But we lost 50% of the country in the U.S. in the last vote to a known felon. I mean, I don't have to tell you the facts, right? And I don't mean that as a political statement. I just mean that as a crass reality, right? And so I would look at every copy, and I would look at it through an equity and inclusion lens, and make certain that the framing of everything that you're saying is not programmatically changing what you're doing, but making certain that it's an inclusive language, right? And that, and this is exactly what you said in our call, right? And so I don't think we shy away from it. Right? I don't think we capitulate. But I think we have to be, I do think we have to acknowledge the reality of where we are in terms of the way that the words that we choose going forward, because there is misunderstanding, or there is very clear understanding that is driving fear. And there is 20 years between now and 2044. Right? And we're about to see 4 years that is going to change our lives in ways that we can't anticipate. So,
I mean, to that point, it's the enemy takes your sword You either find another sword, or you know, I don't want to go the other route, but I think that's the name of the game, right? It's right. You got to find another sword, or find another way to use the sword. And I think that's the thing that we've all dropped the ball on. Those quote unquote progressive, those of us that care about this work, we need to challenge ourselves.
We have one more question.
Thank you all for your perspectives. As communication practitioners, what and how do you advise your employees, especially those who may be exhausted or feel defeated, in terms of how they should communicate about your companies, how they should feel just as a whole, and about your culture?
Go ahead.
So it's a great question. Unfortunately, I think there's an answer, right? So again, I've worked in-house at 3 different places, very different experiences. One of them is rolled back DEI. The other 2 definitively leaned harder in. I get your question. I'm not sure how you can tell them how to feel. I think it's a question of, we're back to values, right? Is that employee resource group really respected as an asset of the enterprise? If they rolled back, probably not. And I can't make someone feel differently about the reality. It's like, when Maya Angelou, right? When someone tells you who they are, believe them, right? And so we're learning who these companies are from a values standpoint. Now, that really sucks, because for some people who have kids in school and a mortgage, they're stuck, right, in that community. And it's not easy just to make a move and change a job, right? So I think you have to figure out from the vantage point of then internally, how do I find my voice? Finding my voice at one company where there was a rollback is very different. Doesn't mean I should be silent. So I think it's how do you, and there's a question of like, how overt are we in this support, right? I don't think in one of my employers that had I run that type of internal campaign, it would have been permissible, much less like respected, right? So I do think it's a case-by-case basis where, again, community I think is such a powerful, there's power in community. Right? So an intersectional communities within companies can have extraordinary power.
As someone who, I'm going to put myself in that group of people of people that are trying to find their voice in this environment, as a leader in this D&I space, yo estoy cansado. Not cansado, cansado. Okay? And I think that's the feel. I'm just exhausted, and I think, that's kind of what I'm communicating to people is, not to get super spiritual here, but I'm leaning into my spiritual practice more than ever, right? I'm meditating more, right? I'm loving on the people that love on me, right? Like, those are the things that keep me energized to do this work. But then I'll also say that, my mentor, I'm going to refer to him often, he said, look, heal, and find your assignment. And that's what I'm asking everybody here to do. Feel what you got to feel, heal it, and then go find your assignment, because the work is about to get hard.
And that's a powerful message to finish with. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Hola. Do you know what's after this talk? I figured you were paying attention to the agenda. So I'm not going to be very long, but thank you, Claudia, IBM, for this gathering. So I'll try to keep this short. Incredible talks. This last panel was incredibly moving. The one before that, about the legalistic aspects, all the data. So, I mean, this is a rich way to kind of close up this session. My question is, are Latinos resilient? Yes. Ándale, that's what I wanted to hear. Órale, okay. We come together as a community that is at a crossroads and under attack. I really believe that. And I, for one, am incredibly displeased with the political future of our country and the lack of support for ethical and moral behaviors and values for our leaders. But regardless of where we all stand, The fact is that the world has changed for everyone, and especially for Latinos. I've spoken to many of our colleagues who are affected and disaffected. Many are entrepreneurs seeking financial opportunities which have dried up on the brink of bankruptcy. Other executives who relied on the spirit of social justice to kind of support their DEI roles and their corporate trajectories. Others are students who just don't care anymore. Well, what do we do about it? This is not the first time that these kinds of situations happen to Latinos. In the past, injustices to the Puerto Rican community, to Cubans, to Mexicans, many others. And our ancestors came to pass with all this, and they made the sacrifices and they fought for us to be here at the IBM headquarters. We have to remember that. And how did they do it? Many united around just common goals, lots of ganas, and what Mr. Rosario said a few minutes ago, relying on their spiritual faith. That's a huge, huge attribute that I think as Latinos we bring to the table. We must do the same. And, thank God for our mamás, abuelas, que vivan las Latinas. So despite the negative whirlwind circling around the Latino community, the calming of nerves really should be centered around all these incontrovertible facts about who we are, and we must take solace in those facts and take that confidence going forward. Here are some of those facts, just to repeat a few more, because I know you've heard a whole bunch. And this is without thinking about immigration going forward. Fact one, Latinos continue to grow at a faster rate than any other group. Higher birth rates and the youth of Latinos contribute to this compelling data. Matter of fact, almost 1 million Latinos turn 18 every year for the next 20 years. We're here to stay. Fact number two, Latinos represent the largest group of consumers, as has been detailed up here with a lot of our marketing folks, and there's the solid base of consumers that many companies are looking for. And these CEOs are paying attention. We are here to stay. Third fact, Latinos represent the largest and fastest growing demographic for the U.S. workforce. I think earlier you heard that 1 in 5 of U.S. workers will be Hispanic between 2020 and 2030. 78% of projected net new workers will be Latino. And the improving educational attainment of Latinos just makes this number even better. Additionally, Latinos and Hispanics are the linchpins for jobs that others may not want to do, such as in construction, landscaping, agriculture, and maintenance. Therefore, the deportation of undocumented immigrants will leave a huge void in these sectors and create a labor shortage that will negatively impact the U.S. economy. We are here to stay. These facts and many more demonstrate the high levels of contributions of Hispanics and commitment to the U.S. economy. You've heard from experts on how we might consider dealing with DEI issues, trying to change hearts and minds. And, notwithstanding all the great work that's been done by, Northwell and Bain, IBM, AbbVie, everybody else up here, much of this messaging, I am afraid, will fall on deaf ears. And I strongly believe we must remember we are in a strongly capitalistic society, whether you like it or not. We are. And so, for whom the messaging around economic issues is critical. And that's been discussed up here already. So the messaging around equity issues will gain more traction when we put it in the context of these broader goals. One objective is to remember we have to quit preaching to the choir. We have to quit preaching to ourselves. We all know the issues. We have to impact others that are around us. That can only happen if we learn to build unity amongst ourselves around an appropriate business case. And many organizations that I've seen have also done some preemptive audits around the legal aspects, as was mentioned up here earlier. To me, that's a critical thing that we must do so that we know we have confidence how to operate going forward. I had the privilege of sitting on the advisory board for PepsiCo for 14 years. Who's for PepsiCo? Okay, all right. Then CEO Steve Reinemund looked at the Latino demographic as a growth sector way before others had even thought about this. This is in the 90s. And PepsiCo was building a steadfast business that focused on 3 key platforms: people, product, and partner. People was the intentional hiring and retention of Latino talent so that PepsiCo could connect with consumers more directly. They built strong Latino teams that were frontline execs, and they created business that wasn't there before. It was not about social justice directly. It was about business. Product was the intentional thoughts of innovating and creating more products that resonated with Latinos and to create stronger emotional ties. And so PepsiCo began importing actually products like Sabritas they had in Latin America, and just created a tremendous business here with many of the immigrants that came here. Again, this was about business. Partner was the intentional formation of bonds with community organizations, the creation of employee resource groups, the funding of similar initiatives to create more trust with the Latino community. Was this about business? Of course it was business. But all of these were very intentional about bringing about social justice through strong business practices. This PepsiCo Power of One strategy is a strong model for us to consider in order to resonate with more Latino, non-Latino ears. It just is effective external messaging, I think. By having a solid business strategy, we develop the muscles to lift each other up. When our country was reeling from world wars, post-9/11 attacks, destructive hurricanes, and the lethal pandemic, Latinos were out there in the front lines as first responders and essential workers for our country when nobody else was out there. We have been the backbone of this country in its rebuilding and holding it up. According to research by Stanford University in Alabama, during the pandemic, Latino businesses grew by 47%, while white-owned businesses declined 2%. And if it wasn't for Latino businesses, the overall U.S. economy would have been at a loss. Thank God for Latino businesses. These are the types of facts that many non-Latinos react to positively, because it is about the green, as Ruth said. We will once again be fighting strong headwinds over the next 4 years, and we must stand strong and united. We cannot afford to speak with multiple voices or to demean each other to the outside world. My good friend Gary Acosta has written about that, speaking with one voice, not talking negatively. But we also have our evangelist here, Claudia Romo Edelman, who's been preaching about this forever. And so we have to resort heavily on continuing to build support for our Latino community by focusing strongly on the economic business case for Latinos. We must continue our commitment to building capacity for our entrepreneurs, our corporate executives, our nonprofit and community-based organizations and foundations, and our young students. We must write our own script and use our positive achievements as tools to build a story, to build a narrative and not rely on others to write some other version of a story. Great insights from our panel too around that piece. Look around you. Look at your neighbor next to you. And everyone is here because you bring unique accomplishments to the table. Each one has your own story, so get to know each other. Let's make everyone else's story our very own. Integrate those together. Let's tell our stories and create that spirit of unity and communion, and by doing that, we lift each other up. So taking everything that these gatherings provide in the next few days, get to know as many others as you can, tell their stories, and help create that solid chain link fence that is inseparable and represents our American identity as Latinos. We are incredibly resilient, and don't forget that. We are here to stay. Yes, we are. Thank you.
Yes, we can. Sí se puede. Thank you so much for this wonderful morning. This is a wrap
for the first part. You're up for lunch. I'm going to stay here every day, as a fact, from 1 to 3, where there's a lunch break, so that any of you that want an open door or whatever, you want to meet with the team and see how we can partner, you're welcome. So for all of you, see you 3 p.m. And thank you so very much for this powerful morning. Give it again for all of us, because we can do this.